Welcome to Surfacing. In this episode, hosts Lisa Welchman and Andy Vitali speak to Per Axbom. Most know Per as the co-host of the UX podcast, but in this interview, they spoke to Per about his research and work in design ethics, his first computer, and his experiences with one of the newest social media platforms, Clubhouse.
So, Per Axbom, thank you for joining us. I think I just learned to pretend how to say Per's name, and I'll fall back to my Americanized version of your name, Per. Thanks for joining us on Surfacing. You were one of the first people that I wanted to invite, mostly because you've interviewed me a lot on UX Podcast, and also everybody knows you from UX Podcast, amongst some other things, but they mostly know you from UX Podcast. And so I thought it'd be really fun to have you come on and talk about all the other amazing stuff you do, most of which really resonates with me. Digital compassion, digital ethics, and misusability are all terms that I've read a lot on your super long-lived blog. And I thought it would just be a great conversation to have with you. So thanks a lot. Let's talk about all of those things. Pick one out of a hat. What's your heartbeat doing right now?
Oh wow, that's fantastic. Thank you so much for having me. This is so exciting, and I don't, as you say, I'm on the UX podcast, but I don't get to talk a lot about my background and what I focus most on. And I think to understand where I'm coming from, I actually want to back up a bit and tell everybody about where I grew up, because I was actually born in West Africa in Liberia. And I lived there for the first 5 years of my life. And then we moved to Saudi Arabia, and we lived in Riyadh for 4 years. And that's where I attended an international school. I think that's where I got my sort of American accent. And then after that, we moved to Tanzania in East Africa. So I have this background of moving around the world and attending international schools and just immersing myself in cultures and understanding different perspectives and ways of seeing the world. And I think as a child, that was extremely enlightening for me, in that we always returned to Sweden, because I am Swedish, I have Swedish parents. We always returned to Sweden during the summers, and having people say with confidence what they thought that the people, or what the way I was living in those countries, they were so certain about how that was and how the people were and about the people's intelligence. It was just so odd to me to see how they could express such confidence in something they knew nothing about. So that's where I started to understand. And
were those
I guess
positive and negative things that they were expressing, or was it just
I think
they were
I
just
react
off?
very off. I think mostly I reacted to the negative, and it made me frustrated. That people would think those things about other people without knowing anything. And it mostly, of course, came down to news reporting and what aspects of those countries were being shown in the news. And this was back in the 80s. So it was like starving children. And that's one aspect of Africa. And I still come across this prejudiced notion of what Africa is when it's such a huge continent with so much diversity. Depending on how you look at it, it could be said it's the largest continent, unless you say that Asia is, depending on what you include in Asia. But it's also, it's 53 countries as well. So I think that is where I grounded this feeling of, I understand, I can become a good mediator because I understand different perspectives, so I can help people understand each other. So I studied communication science, hoping to be able to express content in a way that people can understand it. So writing was what I was doing the most back then. I was writing content and trying to make that content resonate with the target audience and understanding that. So I was doing personas in that sense, in trying to understand who was the person on the other side reading this. And then the internet happened. And I got into usability and had this path that a lot of people in this space have had who've been in it a long time. When you want to get into it and really help people use the technology because you happen to be good at it. I got my first computer in 1982, so I'd been using computers for a long time, and I realized I have this competence, I have this skill that I can use to help other people. And so usability and accessibility became really important to me, and understanding that I have this competence, I can help people, and the technology will probably solve a lot of things. And I was in that headspace of being excited about what the future would bring, and in democratization and people getting access to information, and everything that just broke down over the past 10 years. And just that disillusionment that hits you when you realize, well, it wasn't as good as I thought it was. And I'd been pushing people, of course, because I was so excited about technology, pushing people into this space and being an advocate for it. And now I've sort of shifted and within this disillusionment, found another way of being, another way of addressing technology, and realizing that when you have systems thinking, there's this idea that you have to have a balance. Like if you have a car, you need to have the gas pedal and the brake pedal. You have a pencil, you have the pencil tip, you have the eraser. So the systems always have a feedback loop. And now I'm in the space where I try to be the brake pedal and start to brake. And I try to be the steering wheel, and I try to help people understand that there's not just one path to follow, but we have to decide what direction we want to go in. And that's where I sort of stumbled into the space of digital ethics. And it's just exciting to be in, but very frustrating because I'm passionate about it. It's not something that makes me any money, speaking of all the things I do, because I mostly work with healthcare products, and that's a slow-moving industry. And this thing I do with digital ethics is it's almost mostly my hobby. I blog about it, I do talks about it, and I'm out there trying to make waves and trying to help people understand and create awareness. But it's tough, but you find a lot of allies, and you realize that a lot of people are thinking this way, but just don't know how to find the tools to actually integrate it into their everyday work, because the companies they're not there yet.
I definitely want to go forward into that story, but I also want to go backwards. You said that you got your first computer in 1982. I want to hear more about that. What type of computer was it? Reminisce on it for us.
So I was living in Saudi Arabia, and my dad came home with, it's a tiny computer. Actually, I could show it on camera for you because I have it here in my studio. I can do that later on. We can post a picture in the show notes.
Yeah.
It's tiny. You hook it up, and you hooked it up to the monochrome TV through the antenna, and it just had 1K of memory. So you couldn't really do anything with it except program. So I learned how to program BASIC, beginner's all-purpose symbolic instruction code. So my first program, of course, was, as many people had it back then, I wrote 10, which was the row number of the code, 10, print Pelle. Pelle is my nickname. And then 20, the next row, go to 10. So that created a loop, which printed my name all across the screen. That was my first ever computer program.
How excited were you?
Also very visual. I was really excited. I mean, I typed something on a keyboard there, and it was a membrane keyboard, and something happened on the screen up there. And that was it blew my mind.
It's addicting, isn't it? Like, it only takes one hook of running some code where you're just kind of like, it just feels powerful.
It does. And yeah, exactly. You gain power. And that's, exactly that. And then you want more power. And then you expand the memory of the computer, and you get stronger computers, and you buy a printer, and you have this. My first printer was a thermal printer that actually scraped with heat things off the paper. And then it was like the dot matrix printer that just had 8 dots per letter. And it's been amazing just being part of this journey of computing making its way into everybody's home. But also then when internet happened, when I was getting out and starting to apply for work after college.
And what year did that happen for you, the internet? And when you were saying that, I thought, what year?
Yeah, for me it happened, I think, I met my wife-to-be then in 96. And it so happened that she worked weekends. And the funny thing is that when I reflect back on this, I actually didn't have a computer for 2 years. I didn't think I was going to work in computers. I wanted to be a journalist. But she had a computer sitting in her apartment. She didn't work. She worked weekends, so I was sitting in her apartment in weekends, just getting online with this 14.4K modem, and just right-clicking on web pages and seeing view source and just copying code and seeing what could happen. So it's basically the same type of experience as that first computer, but now it's like I'm copying someone else's code from somewhere else. It's not just from a magazine, and I'll see what happens. Oh, and something happened. Oh, what can I do with that? And just exploring.
And how did you shift from like weekend warrior on the internet to I want this to be the rest of my life?
I think I realized at that point that it came so easy for me because of the experience I've had of using computers since I was such a small kid. So that ease with which it came to me and people expressing, they were impressed by my knowledge. I realized, well, this is too easy. So you mean I can actually work with this? I thought that this was just a toy. I thought it was just for fun. And so then I applied for a job at Ericsson as a web designer, and I got it in '98, and that's how it all started.
You know, it's amazing when we start to play with things and have fun with them, the amount of learning that we do and exploration. It's so different now. You know, when I look through like systems thinkers, and they came from tinkering. And now I wonder if the draw to learning design, learning how to use the internet, learning, you know, development, programming, engineering is tied to like instant gratification in dollars, more so than it was for us when it was just a sense of like something new and something to explore. And it happened to turn into how we make a living. But I don't know that it's where we would have started to think about making a living back then.
Yeah. I try to think about what is the way that kids are doing that today, exploring and thinking. But I see them they're just taking something that's ready and exploring with that. So I don't see the same exploration phase, which is sort of disconcerting to me. And I don't know what to do with that thought. But I wish there was more awareness of how, because so many of us were geeks and just excited about this technology. And that's how we came into this profession. And all of a sudden we gained power, which was just crazy because we didn't have any power back then because everybody thought we were just geeks. And now we're just trying to figure out what we're going to do with it. But we never had that period of time to reflect on what should we do with it. We've just been exploring all along. And that's what a lot of these companies that are releasing app are still doing. So we're still just this young industry, and they're still toying with it. But now it's starting to affect so many people, and nobody's stopping and applying the brake pedal to actually stop and think about it and what's happening.
I mean, I want to pull apart what you just said because I don't disagree with you, but there's also an element of we're old to it. Right. So I remember when I first started in the web. So we have similar paths. Maybe I was a teeny bit a year earlier or something like that. Slightly different path, but still, you know, I remember all the old document management people, particularly at Cisco Systems, because the person who did a lot of the real kind of interesting multi-channel work at Cisco in the mid-90s, so early, was a woman who worked in document management. And then there are folks who worked in document management like Ann Rockley in industry, who's like, you know, genius. You know, everyone talks about content strategy. This is like content strategy with a capital C, capital S, you know, deep taxonomy, metadata-driven content strategies. All of these people come out of the document management space. And I remember they were complaining about web people at the time, trying to organize information online and saying, this is just doc management, and you don't understand the fundamentals of document management. Putting, you know, building a document in components, right? Reusing information, like all the things that we talk about. And so I'm always skeptical when people talk about either millennials or Gen Z or whatever you call them. I don't even keep up on all the names. I agree that they don't understand how the inside of the telephone works, right? But they sure know how to talk on it. And they also sure know how to do stuff I would never think to do with it. Right. And so because they are natives. And so I think for me, and I'd really love to hear what your reflection is on this, it's kind of like how can we be together in this? it's not like we kind of made the mess that they're standing on, right? So we can say they don't understand it, but we also made the mess. And how can we be together? Because they're doing some really interesting and beautiful things with the technology. And, they're doing some not great stuff with it. And we're doing some interesting things. And we're doing, it's from a generational perspective. So it would be great to hear just your reflection on how we can come together, right? And sort of push this generational divide back together and proceed. Because I think we need all parts.
Yeah, I also have this vision of everyone coming together, this paradise vision. I also want to say about that concept of digital natives, because that can also come off wrong in the sense that you can be 80 years old and be a digital native, and you can also be 15. But there are certainly lots of 25-year-olds I know that never use tech. So sometimes all these generalizations can be dangerous as well.
I don't know. I mean, I'm arguing with you. Maybe I'm not supposed to argue with my guest.
You're okay.
Well, but so here's the thing. The thing. Yes, I agree with exactly what you said. And because this issue, if you can't tell, is one that just kind of floats in my head all of the time, right? Like, what's the difference between these generations of people? And I could say my parents are in their 80s. My mom's very digitally savvy. My dad, not so much. He's not a Luddite, but it's just the way his brain thinks it doesn't work so much. But she's not a native. Right? And for me, native means people who take for granted that the technology exists. So you might be 25 and you may not use a smartphone, but I bet you know how one works. Right? And you understand, right? And so
with that definition, yes.
Yeah.
I completely agree.
Well, that's what I'm talking. I'm not talking about people who are aggressing. People who just take it for granted. Like I took for granted the telephone. My parents didn't grow up with phones in their house. For me, like I can't even conceive of a world where I can't pick up a device, right? And talk to somebody. And I still think, we're recording this over Zoom so I can see both Per and Andy, but it's like the Jetsons television program where we're like video talking. Yeah. Like it still feels futuristic to me. Whereas I'm sure a 5-year-old's like, this is life, right? So that's what I think of when I think of native. But go ahead. I'm taking us on a sideways tour. You were talking about something completely else.
No, I think that's amazing. So what this made me think of, which is a sensitive subject just now in Sweden, is this app, Clubhouse. Because Clubhouse is a conversational app where people can get on and talk to each other in rooms around any topic. And some of the things I've discovered on it are exactly what you were talking about. People of different generations actually ending up in the same room and finding out stuff about each other. And I find that so exciting. And why I say it's so sensitive is because that same app is also breaking a lot of EU laws. It's breaking GDPR. It's asking you to share your contact information. And people who don't have an iPhone can't get on it. So it's very much an app for privileged people. But this essence of what the app accomplishes when you are in it and immersed in it and immersed in a room and immersed in conversation, that has uncovered something that I haven't experienced in a long time in a digital space, where people are finding a connection with each other without screen dumping stuff, without retweeting, without liking, but actually just hearing someone's voice and giving them space to speak and giving them space to be listened to. There's something there that's going on. I don't know if Clubhouse will be that future app that will do that, or if other platforms will just copy the functionality. But I think that's another example of a great experiment that is uncovering something that seems to be something that people need, and especially in these times. Because I've heard so many people now express on Clubhouse how they needed this so much, having been at home for so long over the past year during a pandemic. And just hearing someone's voice, they didn't realize, and I didn't realize before it happened, how much just hearing someone's voice, how much that brings a connection to another person. So I've talked always about the barriers that are being broken down thanks to all the chat services and social media platforms. But somebody said in one of these rooms, so Clubhouse is bringing social back to social media. And right now I agree with it. I haven't been on it for a long time. It's something different, and that's exciting to me. And I think we just need to sit down again, apply the brakes, and figure out what is it that is exciting here, and what are still the dangers that could happen here.
I wanted to talk to you about Clubhouse briefly. And just reflecting on what you said, that it's for privileged people, yet it's creating or it's solving a need of people that needed to connect in these times. So, those are two kind of like, it's definitely solving a problem potentially, and it's potentially creating another problem at the same time. Now, how do you think the people behind Clubhouse feel about it? Do they see it 100%? Like, this is a need. I know it's on iPhone only. I don't think that's coming from a privileged space. It's just, it's easier for me to get it out the door first. And I've got an Android version behind that. So I'm just curious, like, the statement that it's for privileged people is 100% spot on. But I don't know that Clubhouse themselves or as the organization look at it that way.
This is hugely interesting. I mean, I don't want to really put thoughts into people's heads. So, I mean, I don't really know what they are thinking. But I believe that it's like the most apps I come across and most digital services I come across, they're just not thinking about the inclusion aspect of it because they're trying something out. And they can hide sort of behind, it's still a beta. So we don't have to have everything working yet. And it makes business sense because one platform, you have that to contend with when you're making it, because that means you only have to change that one platform as you learn stuff. And that's what they're trying to do. They're iterating and releasing new stuff constantly. Having to do that for two platforms would, of course, be hugely more expensive. So it makes business sense. The question is, how do you ensure that you actually do include more people in the end? Well, I've been spending a lot of time. So I find this really interesting. I'm so immersed in it right now. I've been spending a lot of times in rooms where there have been deaf people, blind people, and people with speech impairments. So they are being able to use the app. And that's what I'm trying to, I'm writing a big analysis on this right now. Just this balance that you were talking about, Andy. Yes, it's for privileged people, but is it also including people that have not been included in other spaces? So it's actually creating a space that wasn't there before as well. So it's this whole thing of holding two thoughts in your head at the same time. Yes, it can be very excluded or exclusive, but it can also be including people that have a hard time on other platforms that find it easier to talk to people here. And it can be things like, if you're just nervous, I mean, you're okay to just listen in on conversations as well. I did for a week, just listening in, and people were fine with that as well. And that is inclusive for me. I don't have to feel that I have to participate. That's not the only way to participate in social media. Just listening as well is okay. So there are so many aspects to the inclusive word that I think they are actually succeeding with. And I've also spent time reading the community guidelines, which I know people just don't read. But I find the community guidelines really appealing. I like them. So at the same time as I'm criticizing this app a lot here in Sweden because of the GDPR as well, I'm also recognizing that they are trying. It feels like they're trying. They are acknowledging exactly what I was saying about you are allowed to go in and out of a room. Nobody should feel offended by that. That's okay. It's okay to just listen. And if somebody invites you up on stage, as it's called in Clubhouse, to speak, you don't have to accept. It's okay. So they go through that in community guidelines just to help people feel safe. Now, again, people don't read the community guidelines. People have heard this from me as I've explained them. And of course, that's also how this type of information spreads. But I get the feeling that they're trying to create something that is positive. But they haven't thought of all the odds and ends of what that entails. But that also actually makes me think about, so what's going to happen? They're probably going to get a fine in the EU, and they're going to pay that. And maybe that's been a calculation because they can afford the fine.
Yeah, I always think that's part of the business model.
Yeah.
It's definitely part of Google's business model. But I just want to back up again, as Andy's been backing up. You always say these really rich things. And, the point that's really interesting to me and one that I find myself talking about a lot is that inflection point between invention and innovation. I'm using the I word, invention and innovation, new ideas, creativity, whatever you want to call that pile of where people are pulling something out of thin air and inventing something, or changing something slightly and inventing something, and bringing it to scale. Right. And so somewhere in that mix between, I have got a good idea, I think it might work. If it's Tim Berners-Lee, it's the World Wide Web. I think it might work, and then bringing it to scale. There's some point in there where it's okay to be loose, right? And then there's a point in which you really need to check out some basic stuff before you scale it. And that's an area that Andy and I have been talking a lot about, because we're trying to figure out, what's digital safety mean? You use the word safe. How do you help people feel safe? And so, I have my opinions for the type of work that I do. I also have a philosophical point of view that sometimes people don't agree with, which is, you can't govern or create standards for the most part. I think in the ethical realm, this may not be true, but just from a development perspective, for a product that doesn't exist. In other words, you can overchoke something, like you can overgovern something if you stomp it too early in the gate, right? But at the same time, there are these basic, fundamental, human-centered things, rules that you should never break. Things like don't kill people, or don't be abusive. What do you think's in that pile, like for digital, or just in general? What do you think? What's in that pile of things that we should never violate, right, when we're creating new products and services, versus what can maybe wait till later? And I know I'm really putting you on the spot, and I'm not going to hold you to this, and I'm sure you've thought about this a lot, but I'm curious about that, because that's something that I consider. Like, what does it not go? For me, inclusivity, I'm a Black woman. It's not everything that I am, but all of this information around, algorithmic bias, that's huge for me. Right? I'm just like, how could you even put a product in service that just doesn't work for someone who looks like me and say, okay, we'll address it later? I mean, it's literally so offensive and dismissive that I just can't wrap my head around it. So that's one thing for me, where it's like, it should be work for all people, right? But then what does all people mean? Right? I'm focused on the Black woman aspect of it, but, I can hear. Right? And I speak American English, and there's a bunch of other things that are like that. So what does that pile look like for you?
I'm glad you mentioned the language aspect, of course, because I think that's something that a lot of us don't think about, how many people actually don't speak English and how much content actually isn't available to them just because of that. When I really dove deep into the ethics space was when I was working with a platform for cognitive behavioral therapy. I worked on that for 4 years, an international platform in Sweden that's rolled out throughout the country now. And building that was when I first came across, because according to law, you had to do risk analysis at regular intervals and report back on how you were mitigating different risks. And I've never used the word suicide as much as I've done during those 4 years. And that's when I realized anything we do here, and that actually means that the information between the doctor and the patient doesn't come across the way it should, could potentially, worst case, always lead to suicide on that platform. And that's when I extrapolated on that and realized, well, all these other digital tools I've been working on all these years, I have the exact same challenges with the interface I'm working on. And I haven't even thought or anticipated that those digital services could also lead to people feeling really bad about themselves. And there's just no mechanism for them to report back or to actually even become aware of that. So I'm so worried that we're creating so many things where we're just not aware of the people being hurt. Because it doesn't just have to be users. It could be the people outside who are not the users, who are affected by people's changed behavior because of something we created. And so it's really, really complex. And so it's finding that list of things that this has to be in place, or otherwise we can't launch, is extremely difficult. I think we can do a much, much better job of having these risk analysis sessions at regular intervals and actually thinking about what could potentially go wrong. But the only way to get those right is, of course, is inviting more people, a more diverse set of people to understand the risks. The people least able to understand risk is white middle-aged men like myself. And I've read the studies on that because we're exposed to so little risk. So we need the specialists, the people who are always on edge, who always are the people who are exposed to it. And so that's how you try and mitigate it beforehand. But then you also need the mechanisms. You need that feedback loop again of listening. You always need to be listening and making sure that people aren't being hurt and believing people when they say they are hurt, and not dismissing people because they are an edge case. Because that's the thing as well, isn't it? Because we normalize, in design, we normalize certain behavior, thing that is most in common with most of the people. That's what we design for, because that makes, again, the most business sense. Whereas when I was talking about Clubhouse before and noting that actually people who are not privileged to have these impairments, they can actually use the app. And so there are some privileged people who can't use the app either, but these people can. So it's interesting to see. I think you need to start thinking about that some people, you don't need to design more for them. You need to lift the people that don't have much, that have the least power. And I think that aspect of it is too rarely discussed. And we need those tool sets inside our companies to talk about it and make people aware. Most companies aren't going to invest, and that's one of the things that frustrated me the most about accessibility when I worked across 20 years with accessibility, realizing that I've been giving the same talk almost for 15 years, and things are changing so slowly.
I know.
So why isn't it happening? It's because of, I think, people are still not aware. I think the last time, maybe it was 4 years ago, last time I heard someone actually ask in surprise, oh, so blind people use the internet? Really? And just that not being aware of that group of people using the internet, that was just so strange to me. So what I'm trying to do these days is actually create more awareness and give more power to the people who are on the other side, the users, and helping them give feedback to the companies, showing them how they can actually reach the companies with the concerns that they have. So I've started a website community service thing where I do short videos. Like in Sweden, we have an identification process where you have something called Bank ID. So I show people how they install Bank ID, and I show them who they can talk to if they can't get it working. So I'm trying to teach that aspect of technology to people, because I'm starting to realize that, yes, I can work with the companies, but it's happening too slowly there. So I need the people themselves to actually be more aware of what's happening, know their rights, and understand how they can make things happen better for themselves.
I don't disagree with what you're saying, and I also feel like we need to be careful when we talk about giving people power, right? So I remember growing up, there was, I can't remember, at some point, got in a fight with something, race relations in the United States of America, always a big thing. And someone talked about how their parents marched in the civil rights movement and gave me my rights. And I pointed out to them, oh, yeah, I always had them. Like, you may not have recognized it or whatever. And so I think there's an element of that as well, which is I find myself having to be careful about making sure that when I look at somebody who is otherly abled than me, right, that's not necessarily a downside. Yes, objectively speaking, if you look at power mechanisms, they may not be pushing and driving the money. But those individuals have value. And they have value to me, right? And they're going to make the system better through their intelligence and through things that we think of as others or as disabilities. Can actually, Andy and I met at a conference where a guy gave a great talk, and I'm sure those who work in accessibility, building things that are accessible make them better for everyone. And so I just want to point that out of just like, we're not giving them anything, right? We're shifting ourselves to realize that we've been narrow and that we've been creating things not taking anyone into account. So I hope that sounds.
No, that's a really good point.
Right. And I think if we make that shift, we can really see things differently. It's not like, oh my God, we have to start our project and worry about those damn blind people, right? It's just more like, this is part of the human family, right? And when we're addressing the entire human family, like any family, it's going to be better when everybody's there. And what they bring to the table is going to make us better and make the whole experience better for everyone.
And this is a lot of the messaging that has been in my accessibility talk for all those years that I speak about. And the issue I have, of course, always is that it's happening so slowly. And the companies they're fine with listening to my talks and agreeing with me. But that doesn't change their behavior. That doesn't change that outlook, that we want that outlook. How do I teach them to actually care for other people and understand that maybe growth isn't what we should be focusing on this quarter. Maybe we should be focusing on well-being. And that's, I find it hard to help companies come to that conclusion. So I'm trying to fight this struggle on different sides. I'm teaching them. I'm teaching my peers in the design industry, and I'm teaching the people who are exposed to all these tools all the time, who actually don't understand how to use them right now. But they aren't dumb. And like my mom actually uses a lot of tech, and I realized that if I just spend 3 minutes with her, she gets it. But nobody has ever spent that time with her. And that's so interesting when you have a national ID, like the one I was explaining here, we have it here in Sweden. So you implement the national ID, but then you never create the safe space for people to talk about it. So now we have a national ID that is digital, but where is this safe space to correct around the technology where people can discuss the fears or their doubts or worries and hopes and wishes and whatever that comes along with actually have an ID that you use to identify yourself with different public agencies?
That's interesting because, as you mentioned, growth and how companies, are so focused on growth that they should really just spend time improving the experience for everyone. As designers, as someone that leads design teams, I think it's our responsibility to the companies that we work with and work for to help them understand that is an opportunity for growth for them. That by opening up their products and platforms to a wider base of users, more people to use it and more people to eventually improve it, that leads to growth. So, it's funny because Lisa and I debate about design and the ego of designers, and you talk about that you felt designers drifting far away from the promise of a human-centric focus, right? And I want to hear more about that. Because I'm seeing a little bit of the opposite. I'm seeing designers that are coming out of school that are new in the field, that are so focused on improving things and making products better, making the world better, design as a force for good, that I want to hear where you're seeing the opposite.
I started seeing this when Daniel Kahneman and Richard Thaler, they got the Nobel Prize. So here's Sweden doing its thing again. And we have this...
Why do you all get to decide?
Yeah, exactly. we get this insight into how brains and habits work, and we get all these books being written early 2000s around just coercing people into doing the things that we want them to do. There are behavioral psychology, all these types of different titles that people all of a sudden had. They were experts in showing companies how they could grow by placing buttons in different ways and using text in different ways. We have the whole A/B testing industry that is more concerned about how people click and where they click rather than if they feel good about the product that they bought. So that is where I'm coming from, and the whole Amazon one-click-to-buy thing. Don't get me started. And now they lost that patent, and that's actually being released into every company in the world. So everybody's going to go one-click-to-buy. So as soon as you have this simple way of reducing friction, and reducing friction as one of the tenets of design, and people see that as always positive, then that is the path that we're headed towards. But I couldn't agree more when it comes to the young designers coming out. Because I think that more and more in design schools, it's becoming more common to actually have these. I mean, I teach ethics at a design school as well, and I can see how excited they are about when it's time for my course to come along, as well as the guy who teaches accessibility. This is what they want to learn about. They're so aware. But I don't think that wasn't the design industry that created that awareness. It was something else. I mean, the awareness across the world about social media probably as well, creating that awareness of the circumstances of people across the world. And so they want to do something about it. And so I think there is an incentive now that wasn't there before, perhaps. But it's been all, and sometimes when I give talks, I talk about, back in the early 2000s, we wanted a seat at the table. And we got the seat at the table, but it was at the expense of arguing for our position against numbers. So we can boost numbers. That's what design is for. But it never was really about that, really.
One of the things that I try to do, and it's been ingrained in me from a previous chief design officer, is we have a seat at the table as designers, like anyone else in the organization does. But oftentimes the first question is, so what is the value that you bring? Like, give me the justification for you having the seat at the table. And at the end of the day, the seat at the table is the justification. Like, we don't have to prove every single thing, like the engineering team, like the product team, like the business folks. They don't explain why they're there, right? So as a design organization, as designers, we're always making the case of, we need the seat. Why are we here? Here's why we're here. This is what we're doing. It's like, we need to stop that and focus on the work. And the work itself is the value that we provide. That's the seat. That's our justification. Just having that job is the justification for us being there. So it's interesting that, you know, we focus so much on how we do things instead of what we do. Yeah. And you talk about that in the form of, you know, we need to have these numbers, like we're promising all these results. But at the end of the day, the result is our product is more usable. Our product is well received. People are solving the needs that they had. They're able to achieve their goals. And to me, that's the justification for what we do.
Well, for both.
Thank you. That's so good. That was exactly, you started on the question, and that was exactly the rant I was going to go on, and it was so perfect because you did it for me.
I mean, I want to ask both of you designers, because I'm not one. I'm a designer of people systems, but I'm not what people think of as a designer. So you have this seat at the table, and I mean, I run into that whole barrage of folks that Andy mentioned, right? When I'm doing governance work, I'm trying to get these people to work with intent and together. So designers sitting at the table, yes, they need to have a seat at the table. We could argue about that, but no, I'm not going to, because yes, they needed. But how do you engineer this ethical responsibility at this table, right? I mean, this is the big question, right? And so one of my challenges with designers is, or with any of these set of people, because they all say, we should do it. Content people say it's the content. Design people say, they're usually talking about visual design. They'll say that, but then they'll say, no, it's not just visual design. That everyone's trying to get on top of the pile. The only one that's actually not trying to get on top of the pile is the engineering stack people, because they know that stuff isn't going to run if they don't do their stuff. And so they're just kind of silently there. But everybody else is trying to say, no, it's us, it's us, it's us. You know, from your perspective, either of you, where would you put that? At what point in the process is an easy question to ask, but who is it inside of the organization that's driving this ethical conversation? Because if no one's owning that conversation, it's just sort of floating around in the ether and something you bump into occasionally.
Yeah, I mean, that is so eloquently put. I think everybody wants to own it. Somebody saw it, and so they want to run with it. And I think that's what we're doing, seeing with Tristan Harris and this whole humane technology movement, in that somebody wants to take this flag and own it and say that we own this ethics space. But of course, anyone could own it. It could be customer service. It could be anyone, as long as everybody's involved in the conversation and we're creating awareness around the problems. And I totally agree with this problem with that we're saying this is what needs to be done. I think that's my biggest weakness, because I don't take the lead. I'm contemplative and try to think a lot, and somebody else is more loud, and of course it's easier to follow them. And that's always the problem when you try to reason and reflect and go slowly, is that but what I try to do, and this comes from I studied coaching for a year as well, and that's when I learned that being a consultant was completely wrong of me. Because as a consultant, I always give advice, and as a coach, I actually ask people to discover what they already know. And so in these meetings, because I have the privilege of sitting at a lot of these meetings where a lot of people from companies and management are sitting around, and I ask questions. And I ask questions like, so if it turns out that somebody gets hurt by this thing we're building, what tools do we have in place to handle that? And so I expose it by asking the question and not by telling them, because I already, of course, know that they don't have the tool. But they don't know that, and I'm just being inquisitive. And so the more times I start asking these types of questions, the more aware they become that there are holes, there are things that can go wrong. And sometimes I even go as far as to give examples from other companies, of course. And when I do that, so it's a slow process. And that's also, of course, what's so frustrating for a lot of people in this space, that you have to be aware that it is a slow struggle. It has to be, because people have to be with you, and they aren't there yet. And so they have to go slowly there with you. And you do that by inviting them, not by telling them what to do.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, inviting people. So what I've seen is in a lot of organizations, the product teams are siloed by product or by lines of business. The engineering team's a little bit heads down. The design team actually has that visibility into things that are happening amongst all the different like organizational silos. So they're the ones that can see an opportunity and then use design as a collaborative, like pulling people together exercise to start to have those conversations around this joint ownership, right? For something like ethics. At the end of the day, obviously there needs to be a single decision maker. Right. It can't be like 5 people owning a decision, because then decisions never happen. But the value that I see that design brings isn't to stack their hand on top of the pile, but to bring everybody together so that we can have that conversation around who actually does make this decision and what is happening in these different parts of the organization that may not realize that it's happening. So to me, design is that like pulling everything together type of role in that situation.
See, I think that's true operationally, but, I'm biased. I think it's a cultural issue, right? And that it's really an executive function to establish a culture of safety, to establish what the ethical frame is for an organization, because there's so many people executing on it. And I am biased because, decision-making to me is governance. And nobody wants to say that, right? Because what an ugly word. It's really horrible. That's stuff that big bureaucratic organizations do. But we're governing all day in like crappy ways, like and that sort of thing. I think, to name one of the obvious, I think part of the Facebook challenge right now is that their governing framework is such that one individual, Mark Zuckerberg, has complete control over what they do and do not do. And so his cultural values, his personal values, how he sees things drive the entire process. You can imagine he could be a completely different person with a completely different belief set, and this whole thing would have spun differently. And so I think you can't really underestimate some very, very simplistic things like the value system of leadership and what type of messaging that they're giving and what type of, in the ways in which they drive the team into what ends, right? So we can talk about money, but there are cultural ends. Are you a nice company? Do we abuse people's trust? Is it okay to trick people, right? These are things that really come out of a value system of an organization. And even when you have a really intense governing framework in place, like in a military situation, there's still governing mechanisms that are going to control all of that. So I think it's all an and, like it's all of these people need to get together. And because it's an and for the entire organization, that makes it something that executives have to drive. They have to say, that's not okay for us. For us to behave that way is not okay, right? And I think that's really where it's going to end up being. And that's why it's so slow. Because you're shifting a culture where, particularly for organizations that existed prior to the web, where that stuff just, is deep. It's very, very deep, and you've got to dig it out. So hopefully things will be working better over the next 50 years. So one of the things that I saw on your website this morning when I was refreshing my brain before we talked to you was digital compassion. And so I'm a very serious meditator, and so I hang out with a lot of Buddhists that talk about compassion and empathy all of the time. But I was really interested in why you picked that word, right? So ethics, misusability, I read about that, and I get that. But where do you think compassion sits in this frame, and why did you pick that to emphasize?
I think that I started with the misusability phrase, I think, and that's when I started doing my ethics workshops, because that was easier for people to understand in that, yes, we are doing usability, but sometimes when we do usability, and even successfully, we actually hurt people. But I kept coming back to that problem space, which I was mentioning, that I'm finding it hard to help people to understand that they need to care about other people, which is what it really comes down to. So I think compassion for me, and I actually intentionally avoid the word empathy, because I think it's really, really hard to feel empathy for anyone and everyone, and try to actually say that I am able to find empathy for the people I design for. I don't think that's what's going on at all, but I can decide that I care about the people I design for and feel compassion for them and for their circumstances, even though I don't understand it. And I think that being able to do that gives you so much, that gives you power as well as a designer, because all of a sudden it's not about knowing what people need, it's about having to ask people what they need, because that's the only way you're going to find out, because you don't know. So compassion is about always being prepared to immerse yourself in spaces where you may be uncomfortable, but it's your job because you are going to be affecting these spaces with the way you are designing. I think that's something we don't acknowledge enough as designers, the power that we wield, the power that we have actually to expose people to decision-making processes where we decide what is the preferred choice and the secondary choice. We even teach that in design schools. So this is a primary button and this is a secondary button. So we're doing choice architecture. So we are actually influencing what you should think is the better choice. And we keep doing that. And unless we actually always, and not just before we're designing, but during we're designing and after we've designed, we need to be speaking to the people who are affected by what we're making. And that is, I think, is compassion for me. And I've been using that word. I used it as the title for my handbook as well, Digital Compassion, where I try and help designers understand that there are other ways of thinking about design. And because I think we've been taught for so long what design is. And what I realized when I started talking about these issues is that people came up to me afterwards and always, oh, thank God somebody's talking about this finally. And people had been wary of actually raising their voices and saying the same things. But it wasn't new. It was just that it was silenced, in that we're supposed to work with making all experiences frictionless. That's our job as designers. But now we realize that, well, when we do that, it can lead to some devastating problems. And so here are some other tools. Here are some other ways of working. And people actually really, really appreciate that. So I've seen people implement, like I have this tool called the Inclusive Panda. I've seen people using that in workshops, and it's like, wow, so something I invented is actually being used out there. And that's fun. But it's the most fun part is the conversation is happening, because that's all it is. It's a conversation starter. And so they feel more at ease having the conversation if they have an artifact to talk around.
You know, I mean, I was thinking about empathy versus sympathy versus compassion, because when I was working in healthcare, and I would explain something very similar to the doctors and the medical staff that I was working with. They're like, you don't understand how much compassion just burns you out, right? And I'm like, well, you know, how is it really different than empathy? And I think you did a really good job of describing why we need to have compassion for the people, because we can't actually put ourselves in their shoes, right? We don't know everything that they're experiencing. So I want to hear more about the panda. That's what I see it behind you, and I hear that it's you explain that it's a tool being used in workshops. So I'm just curious, like, can you talk a little bit more about that and how that leads to designers getting more compassion for the people that we're designing for?
Yeah. I call it the Inclusive Panda. And it started with me drawing a bunch of circles, trying to figure out different spaces of things to talk about when it came to inclusion. And all of a sudden, it started looking like a bear. And I don't know why I made it a panda, but it turned out I wanted to make it memorable, I think. And so that actually also makes it easier to describe on a podcast. So there's a big circle that is the head of the panda, which actually then is everybody who uses your digital service. Even the ones you haven't thought of, but everybody who is a user of your digital service. And then you have the left ear, which is also a circle, but it overlaps with the head. So those are the people who are excluded for accessibility reasons and more. And an interesting thing with the overlap is that you realize, well, some of the people with accessibility issues actually are still using the service, but you're not aware of them. So you're not talking to them. So you can do stuff that happens which throws them out or can bring more people in, but you don't know because you're not actually paying attention to them. And then you have the right ear of the panda, which is also a circle that overlaps on the opposite side. And those are the people you want to exclude. And this is a concept that is difficult for a lot of people. Oh, so now we want to include people. But the absolute easiest way to think about that is that some apps for children should exclude adults, and some apps for adults should exclude children. And so you actually have to make an effort to not let people in that could harm the people that you're actually trying to help. So that one creates a lot of interesting discussions. And so even around spaces such as Slack groups at companies, this is interesting because does everybody have to be on the Slack, and does everybody feel as comfortable talking about the Slack, or do some people have more power than others? So if somebody is in the group talking on Slack, does that mean other people are silenced? And so those types of discussions come up. And then you have the snout of the panda, which is a smaller circle within the big one, and those are the people you're actually designing for, because those are the people participating in your usability tests and you're doing interviews with. So that's just such a small segment of all the people that are affected by what you're doing. And that's what you have to recognize as well, that it's still just a small part of the puzzle that you actually have and are usually able to keep in your head. And finally, there's the nose, which is this even smaller circle inside the snout, which are the people who you are designing for, but who are still getting hurt. So they're still getting hurt because either you're letting other people in that are hurting them, like we were talking about the other ear, or you're actually made some bad design decisions. So by talking about all these aspects of the panda's face, structurally and in order, you can actually start to have really, really interesting discussions about exclusion, inclusion, and who we haven't even thought about. And when you bring more people into that space to talk about that model, you get some interesting thoughts that you probably haven't thought of yourself.
Nice. I wanna explore that with my team actually now, after hearing about that and reviewing some of our existing products.
That makes me so happy.
So Per, now that I know how to pronounce your name, I'm going to be saying Per all day long.
Nice.
Thank you. Really appreciate you being here with us. It's good to talk. I think we could talk a lot more. I forgot how much I miss talking to you. So I really appreciate that and appreciate your time.
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful. Spending
Awesome
time with you.
Yeah, Per, it was great to really get to talk to you for the first time. Just for anyone else that wants to reach out and have a conversation with you or find out more about you, where should they go? What can they do?
The space I'm most active in is still Twitter. So Axbom, AXBOM on Twitter is where you'll find me. And from there, you'll find everything else.
Wonderful. The center of your universe. Well, have a good day. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoy surfacing, please rate, review, and follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts. Also, consider supporting the podcast on Patreon at patreon.com/surfacingpodcast. If you have suggestions for guests or a topic you'd like to hear about on surfacing, please reach out via the contact form found at surfacingpodcast.com.